In the dark and stormy times of the 1770s, the lords of the Royal Navy gathered quietly in a cabal to discuss the ships they needed. And they decided to approach one of the Woodicombe, a architect by the name of Thomas Slade, and they charged him to forge from wood and iron and copper and steel and hemp the Inflexible class. A class which, when they entered service, would be forever thought by many of their sailors to be absolutely intractable, but would be equally intractable in the views of their enemies. I am, of course, talking about the Sisters of HMS Africa, the vessel that formed its own third line at the Battle of Trafalgar. I'm talking of the Inflexible class. Inflexible, Africa, Dictator, and Scepter. And now, let this key ships begin. Sorry. I couldn't resist that, okay? Look, they deserved a big intro, and I kept experimenting with various methods of doing it. In the end, the only big intro I could do, which actually sounded mildly appropriate, was me doing my movie intro voice. But the trouble is that voice makes me giggle every time I do it, because I've been doing it to make little cousins giggle for, like, the last 25 odd years of my life, and I'm almost pre-programmed. So I apologize, but yes, it did end with a giggle. So it's actually a really interesting class, and it's a really interesting piece of naval history, because the Royal Navy starts off by going, well, we're already building 74s. Do we want to build some 64s? And the answer is yes, we do. We do want to build some 64s. And one of the interesting things is this is by no means the last class of 64s they built. That goes to the Crown class. HMS Crown, Ardent, and Scipio. Yeah, HMS Scipio. Named for a very, very good Roman general, to be honest. And they're all ordered in in the 1770s. They're building them. Why are they building 64s, though? What's the reason for it? Surely the 74s are the excellent third rate of their period. Why are you building a 64? Well, for the Royal Navy, it wasn't quite so clear-cut. You see, a 64 is something they've been building for a long time. They had a lot of faith in their 64s. They were useful ships. And they were just that tad smaller, just that tad easier to support at longer range than the 74s. And whilst eventually, as infrastructure grows over time and matures and is made more and more useful and enters into service more and more, the 64s become less and less that advantageous. There are actually several battles in the Royal Navy's history which are 64 battles, where if you're looking at the ships, almost every single vessel involved is a 64, as far as from the Royal Navy, and even from other nations, for similar reasons. It's logistics. It's a case of, yeah, we can support the 74s. Yes, they're brilliant. They're brilliant in the Caribbean. They're brilliant off the coast of North America. They're brilliant off the coast of France, in the Atlantic coast, and Copenhagen, and they're very good in the Mediterranean. But if we want to go into the Baltic, we're sending in the 64s. If we want to operate in the Indian Ocean, we're sending the 64s. And yes, the 74s do go up there, but the thing is, the 64s are the first choice, if they're available. If we're sending ships to go even further, and we have to send a ship of line very long range, we might send a 74, but if we have a good 64 around, we'll be tempted to send that. So that is this class. They are not the last class of 64s, they are the second to last class. But boy, do these 4 ships have a service. I mean, you can be excused for thinking Africa's the only one which is famous, but in their time, these 4 ships, all of them, do things which are worthy of fame. Dictator is probably single-handedly the greatest scourge the British have ever sent to fight the Danish Norwegians. And honestly, she also wound up the Russians and amply annoyed the French. And that was just in a few battles over a couple of year period. I mean, the Swedes loved her, but they were fighting as her allies. That is, of course, the Gunboat War, which, if you haven't heard of, don't worry, it happens between 1807 and 1814, and honestly tends to get completely ignored by because of the other events going on at the time. But the Royal Navy's there. It's another one of the reasons why when people go, War of 1812, why are the British not there? And why do the British have these forces they do have out there for the Americans? Well, that's because they have forces out fighting the French, the Danish Norwegians, and others around the world. HMS Africa, though, does happen to be herself, and this is one of the lesser-known stories about her, chases the USS Constitution, along with a pack of other similarly inclined vessels. And the USS Constitution decides that it would rather be anywhere but near them, so it crams on all sails and manages to get away. But Africa is an interesting one, because accounts vary on how close she gets, and whether or not she was trying to do an overtake. There seems to be some of the positioning that Africa had worked out that if they tried to do one diversion, the only way that could be covered was if they were there. And so, theoretically, if Constitution ended up trying to pull that trick to get away the way that Africa was, it could have ended up being a fight between HMS Africa and USS Constitution one-on-one for quite a while. And that would be an interesting fight, because let's be honest, those ships are an interesting matchup. You've got a heavy frigate and a light third rate, or rather a 64-gun third rate, so not as much of a firepower advantage as you'd normally expect, but does have 26 24-pounders, 26 18-pounders, 10 4-pounders, and 2 9-pounders as standard, and as we all know, Royal Navy ships and being fitted as standard is only something which happens in peacetime, when politicians and members of the Treasury can object to the extra expense. So yeah, this is an interesting class, and I hope you're going to enjoy this key ships, because I'm going to try and do some more Age of Sail key ships, because I think they've been suffering in comparison. They haven't been getting much attention or much love this year in the year of the aircraft carrier so far. Tribals, Battles, and Darings. Yes, in every video I do a shameless book plug, and I do it for a reason. One, I like to thank you all for supporting the channel, and if you do like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the engagement in the YouTube channel. And comment, that's always lovely. There's usually a question asked at the end of videos, so you can always, if you're not sure what to comment, wait till then and maybe put in an answer to the question. I know quite a few people enjoy doing that, and I enjoy reading them. And when I do comment response, I get to talk through those responses and those comments. And also, if you wish to support the book habit, which really underpins this entire channel, there's membership, there's Patreon, there's Ko-fi. Ko-fi, although mostly goes to Iron Brew, I have to admit, which keeps me going. Now, the reason I do the shameless book plug in every single video is because I'm an academic. And as much as I enjoy doing YouTube videos, as much as I will always try and do YouTube videos, or whatever comes after YouTube, I am an academic, and the rules of promotion and getting a permanent job in the UK, etc., if you want to get into certain university, well, pretty much any university, especially in naval history terms, is you have to be published, and your book has to sell well. All your books have to sell well. At the moment, I only have one book. I'm working on others, but I only have one book at the moment. So, Trials, Battles, and Darings, and I will do shameless book plugs of it, because I love it, and it's on its second edition, and I'd like as many copies as possible to be sold. So thank you, because that's how I turn being a contract lecturer into hopefully a full-time lecturer, or at least a part-time permanent lecturer. I'd should probably be happier with a part-time permanent post. I have to admit that. I would love the full-time one. I wouldn't turn down the full-time one. I'm not that kind of silly, but I do think it would be easier to keep the YouTube channel and all my independent research going with a part-time post than a full-time post. And that's a decision I can make at the moment, because literally all I have to support in my life is myself, so I don't have a partner, a wife, a family and kids or something like that, you know, to support. I just have me, so I can afford to be like that. So, before the class, well, the Woodicum. The Woodicum. I was thinking of something which would be the Royal Navy's equivalent of the Mechanicum for that sort of period, and I decided with the Woodicum. I was going with the Carpentercum, but that sounded weird. Carpentercum sounds weird. Probably more accurate with compared to Mechanicum, but Carpentercum, yeah. So I went with Woodicum. Slade is one of the Royal Navy's best naval constructors of this period, and he rarely goes wrong. Inflexible does turn out to be an absolute nightmare to sail, though. But there's a reason for this, because they start off with HMS Neptune, which was a 90-gun second rate. A very good vessel, but a 90-gun second rate. And they go, let's try scaling it down. And so they produce a class of 74s, the Albion class, which are also very good ships. They really are. Very, very good ships. And then someone comes up and well, we want to do some more 64s. Why didn't you scale it down further? So the Inflexible design is a scale down of a scale down of a design. You're starting to see where some of the problems might have crept in here. What's really interesting about the Albion class, though, is that they are far, far from the last third-rate class to be produced by the Royal Navy. In fact, the Royal Navy is still producing third rates with 74 guns. Well, they're ordering them in 1812 and 1813, and they are launching them in 1817 and 1820 in the case of HMS Hawke. In fact, HMS Wellesley, one of the last 4 74s built for the Royal Navy, the Black Prince class, she's actually sunk by an air attack from the Luftwaffe in 1940. She'd been built at Bombay Dockyard. I don't know. A perfectly good third rate. A perfectly fine third rate. Sunk by the Luftwaffe in 1940. That's just rude. That is just rude. But, yeah, these classes had a lot going for them in terms of Albion, and they were good, and Neptune was very good, and then, so you can understand the Royal Navy's logic, but one of the few things that are always true in naval architecture: scaling up a design scaling up a design you can keep doing. To an extent, you can't go on ad infinitum, but you can scale up a design. Scaling down a design is far more difficult. It's always better to start off with a small version and work up to the bigger version when you're talking about ships than to work down, because the calculations are just so much easier. They really are. So let's look at the class of what we got. What we get. Well, luckily they're sort of fitted into two pairs. You have Inflexible and Africa are really sort of one style design, and Dictator and Scepter are slightly different. But when you look at these designs in full expansion, you can look at them for me and go, how much difference is there really going on? How much is there really different in these ships? Now, we've already discussed their guns, but it's worthwhile stating again that it's 26 24-pounders, 26 18-pounders, 10 4-pounders in the quarterdeck, and 2 9-pounders in the forecastle. But what are they in terms of length? What are they in terms of beam? Well, they're interesting, is what. They are 159 feet long at the gun deck, which is 48 meters. 130 foot 7.5 inches on the keel, which is 39.8 meters. And the beam is 44 foot 4 inches, or 13.5 meters. Now, it's worthwhile also considering that they are roughly 1,380 to 1,420 tons burthen. Again. And the depth of the hole, it was listed at some points as being 18 foot 10 inches, or 5.74 meters. But each one has slightly different sizes, and it's worthwhile noting that HMS Africa herself was 160 foot 10 inches long, that's 49 meters at the gun deck, and 132 foot 9 inches, 40.5 meters at the keel. She had a beam of 44 foot 9 inches, which was 13.6 meters, and the depth of the hole was roughly the same again. It was 18 foot, and in her case, 18 foot 1 inch, so it was 5.5 meters. So her keel was slightly shallower than supposedly the standard design. They are interesting overall, because they are each a product of a slightly different construction. This is the point. The Inflexible is built by they're all built to the Slade's design, but they're built by Barnard at Harwich in the case of Inflexible. Also, Barnard builds Africa, but that's at Deptford. And Dictator is built by Batson at Limehouse. And Scepter is built by Randall at Rotherhithe. And these are all shipbuilders. Now, the purpose that happens here is that the design is produced by the constructor, the architect. He'll work up the design. And then the design is passed on to a builder. Builder is responsible for the construction of that ship throughout its construction. So they basically take the design and interpret it. And then they will have officers of the yard beneath them who will be responsible for overseeing the individual parts of that construction. The rights. So, differences will crop up. In fact, often did crop up. But let's look at their careers, shall we? And starting off with the namesake of the class herself, Inflexible. Now, with Inflexible in her career, she has quite a good one. She's laid down in 1777 after having been ordered in February 77. She's laid down in April 1777. Try saying that 3 times fast. And she's launched the 7th of March 1780. And the reason we date ships from when they're launched rather than when they're first commissioned is because in this period it was quite common for ships to be on ordinary for years after they've been launched. So they could be launched in, let's say, 1760 and they might not be actually first commissioned until 1772. So you date a ship by its actual age, not by its first commission. But she doesn't have to do that. She's commissioned quite quickly. In fact, she ends up fighting at the Battle of Cuddalore, which, you know, I'm going to talk about quite a bit of her. She does go on to the Egyptian campaign, where she gets to be part of the Royal Navy's operations there, and she takes part in the Second Battle of Copenhagen in 1807. But I'm going to talk about the Battle of Cuddalore with her, because that's a true 64 battle, which I already alluded to earlier. Of the 15 French ships, 7 are 64s and 1's a 60. Of the 18 British ships at the battle, 9 are 64s and 1's a 68. So, yeah, the 60s are in force in this battle. Now, it's an interesting battle, I have to admit, because what happens out is the British are sieging Cuddalore. And the French come to try and interdict with the siege, to break the siege up. And at first, they don't really succeed. Because what happens is the winds are being so annoying, they're playing around so much, that it's only on the 20th of June, despite having been playing around for about, over a week, that a consistent wind develops, that Hughes lines up for battle. And this is at 1600 hours in the afternoon on 20th of June. Suffren lines up and orders to attack as well, and they, in line, bombard each other for 3 hours. Yes, it goes on from 1600 hours to 1900 hours. The British have 18 ships, the French have 15 ships, and yes, this battle, the Battle of Cuddalore, if you look it up on Wikipedia, is part of the American Revolutionary War, it's considered, involving France. It's not, okay? Look, I love the way Wikipedia works. It's very useful for me to go and track down pictures, which I'm sure I can be able to use in terms of educational videos like this without having to deal with copyright people. And that's something I love and I use quite a lot. And I'm quite happy to use it shamelessly. Rather like my book plugs. But I think when you were including every single battle between England and Britain and France in that period as part of the American Revolutionary War, you're either trying to show how little involvement the Americans actually have in the American Revolutionary War, because those battles all involve Britain and France fighting in India in this case. This is off the coast of India, which kind of makes America a sideshow in its own Revolutionary War. If you're fighting major naval battles off the coast of India, throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the North Atlantic and the Caribbean, and, you know, you're doing all these things, and then North America gets a handful of battles in comparison, or you're trying to subsume us all into that war when it's really, really beyond that war. It's far more complicated than that. So, yes, it's in the right time period. No, it's not part of it. No, I think we can... Can we all please just agree that the wars in the Indian Ocean are definitely not the American Revolutionary War? They are the British and the French fighting over control of India, and Mysore and all the other things that get involved in it are just bystanders who get caught up in it. It's not. There is no strategist in the UK sitting there going, But if we win in India, we can then win in America. Or thinking, if we win America, we can then win in India. They're not. It's completely different campaigns. And it's the same with the French. They pummel each other for 3 hours, and Suffren leaves. Suffren's fleet anchors 25 nautical miles north of Cuddalore after the battle, and Hughes anchors near the city. So Suffren hasn't made it. But Hughes has food issues, he has water issues, and he has some of the ship's damage. So he decides on the 22nd of June, he's going to go to Madras. 21st of June, he's going to go to Madras to get repairs and get food, etc. His resupply fleet hasn't been working properly as it's supposed to. And Suffren uses this opportunity. Hughes apparently cites them on 22nd of June, but there's a bit of debate about that one. He cites scurvy and short of water as a reason he doesn't engage, but there's also a question as to how feasible it was in the weather patterns at the time. But probably with Bing in mind, I can understand why him saying, you know, there are lots of reasons other than just weather that I'm not engaging the French. Please don't cut my neck off. Suffren managed to get in on the 23rd of June. He found the British supply fleet, which was supporting the besieging army, not there to support the navy, and managed to force them to withdraw. So he dropped off some 1,200 troops he borrowed from the garrison and landed an additional 2,400 men to support it. And the sortie from the city, which had been reinforced by those extra 3,600 troops, was repelled, but meant that the British were weakened, and so nothing had really happened until 29th of June, when a British ship came up with the news that the preliminary peace agreement had been agreed between Britain and France, which meant hostilities ceased on the 2nd of July. So, what is that? That is a strategic victory because he gets in and gets to resupply the city. So it is a win, but it's not a win as in a win in the battle. It's kind of, again, it's an unsatisfactory win. It's kind of like Jutland. It's a British strategic win, but it's an unsatisfactory one. And they both lost people killed and wounded. Britain 533, France 478 killed and wounded. But it's a 64 battle. And again, of the 33 ships of the line out there, it's quite a few number of them, 16 of those vessels were 64s, and there was also a 68 and a 60. So you could go as high as saying it's 18 out of 33 ships were roughly in this category. And then we have HMS Africa, which I then went with the other method of organising all the campaigns, etc., in sort of date order. Constitution, almost called Constitution, 17th of July, 1812. Gunboat War, 1807 to 11. Battle of Trafalgar, 1805. Served as a hospital ship, 1798 to 18. I think 03, but could have been 02, and then is reconfigured back into a warship. Haiti campaign, 1796, and of course part of the Battle of Cuddalore. Now, this is a ship I have already covered in videos on the Battle of Trafalgar, what she does at Trafalgar, where basically they turn up, they look at the fleets gathering and go, well, we can either tack along the lines, try and tack round and join up on the lines, we won't be in battle for ages, or we can go straight down the French line ourselves. And that's exactly what I do. That's why there's that picture at the top there. That picture is her being towed away after the battle, dismasted and damaged, because she went the entire way down the line the hard way solo. She did it. She's Africa. Never doubt her. Never doubt her. She's a mighty, mighty ship in the history of the Royal Navy. A very capable one. But, honestly, for me, it's the Gunboat War where she has some of the most interesting times, because she takes on whole flotillas. On the 15th of October 1808, she's escorting a convoy of 137 merchant ships through the Baltic, with the assistance of a bomb vessel, HMS Thunder, and 2 gun brigs. So, not really the strongest battle fleet, but enough. A bomb vessel probably ranks in equivalent to a low-level frigate. Especially as a bomb vessel is going to be very heavily armed. Basically, a bomb vessel is one of those vessels, often colliers, which have been converted to carry mortars, so they can bomb places which are being besieged from the sea. They left Karlskrona on the 15th of October, and on the 20th of October they'd anchored off Oresund, off Malmö. Noon on the 20th of October, a flotilla of Danish gunboats decided to move towards the convoy, and Africa went to intercept them. This flotilla of gunboats coming to fight her were 25 gunboats, 7 armed launchers, mounting between them 70 heavy cannon and 1,600 men, all under the command of Commodore John Cornelius Krieger. At 13:30 hours, the wind died and Africa was immobilized. That's not good. By 14:50 hours, the gunboats had stationed themselves off Africa's quarters, where few of her guns could fire, and they opened fire. The battle continued until 18:45 hours, when night closed and all firing ceased. It was considered by many that if night had held off for longer, for even now, the Danes might have captured Africa. Nightfall, however, meant both forces left the field without victory for either side. Africa had lost 9 men and 51 wounded, including her captain, John Barrett. She had to return to Karlskrona for repairs. The convoy managed to reach Britain intact. In 1810, George Frederick Reeves commanded Africa this time, and he brought home a large convoy, despite a severity of weather and gales. Now, the interesting point I should make here is that it was believed that if they'd been able to batter her for another hour, they would have been able to capture her. After all, they'd only been battering her for nearly 4 hours already when they ceased fire. And whilst 9 men killed and 51 wounded is a lot, it is a lot. The standard crew was 480 to 520. She was probably at about that level. And she held her ground. And notice this thing. They held their ground at the Battle of Cuddalore for 3 hours, fighting away. She holds her ground for very nearly 4 hours, fighting away. Despite being surrounded and not being able to maneuver because of no wind, she fights away and holds her ground for 4 hours. So I can get the idea these are very steady, very sturdy ships, very strong ships. They're designed and built to take a pounding and keep on working and keep on fighting. And she keeps her crew fine. Again, she's been bombarded for 4 hours and of a crew of nearly 500. Let's split the difference and go with nearly 500. She has 9 killed and 51 wounded. By the equivalent firepower of, let's be honest, another third rate. 74. Yeah, probably, because the guns were they were heavier, slightly heavier cannon than normal. So yeah, probably works out about the same level of firepower. Firing from quarters. Makes it really interesting, the idea of what happens if they caught up with USS Constitution. Come on. Africa's theoretically this ship sitting out over here. It's all sorts of fun things in this carving. But, yeah, these are solid ships, the 64s. And in this particular scenario, Ilias was a 32-gun amphibian-class frigate. Belvedere was a 36-gun Apollo-class frigate. Guerrier was a 38-gun frigate, originally of French construction. She, of course, will eventually manage to get her fight with USS Constitution. And Shannon, a 38-gun Leder-class frigate, which also is quite famous for her tour in the war. Africa is the ship of the line in this fight. She's the third rate backing up these frigates. There are 2 frigates here who can hold their line with, hold their own with Constitution, probably. At least 2. But Africa's the real threat. Africa in 1812 is the real threat. Constitution gets in a fight with her. It's not going to be a good fight. And then we have HMS Scepter. Third in the class. Sometimes this is the fourth. I always lift her as first because, again, I go by date launch. 1783, 1781, 1781, 1780. So that's what I structure them as. Scepter, she is her own special case. Battle of Trincomalee in 1782. Battle of Cuddalore in 1783. Haiti Campaign, 1794. Capture of Dutch East Indiaman in 1795. Technically not supposed to do it at that point. Technically not supposed to. It's one of those scenarios where you look at it and go, were you supposed to do this? Were you supposed to? You sure? And I have to say, this is an even... the Battle of Trincomalee is an even more of a 64 fight than the Battle of Cuddalore. And again, it's Edward Hughes versus Suffren. You might notice there's a small theme going on here, and this is declared as an indecisive fight. Just wait until you hear the stats for this battle. I'm not saying it's a repeat again, but I will say this: you can be excused if you start to think the whole Indian Ocean War is just a fight between Suffren and Hughes, going backwards and forwards to seeing who can blast the other one for the longest, and trying to work out who's actually won the battle. So many battles are indecisive. It could be because of their 64s, but pretty much it's this. Following the Battle of Negapatam, Hughes had needed to spend weeks, at least 2 weeks at sea, and then finally being able to put into Madras for repairs. At Madras, he's joined by Scepter and San Carlos. Now, Scepter and San Carlos are useful additions. Scepter, of course, is a 64. And anyone want to guess what San Carlos is? Roughly a 44. She's probably she's a fifth-rate frigate. Probably. There's a whole discussion about that one. We'll leave that to one side. Anyway. He now has to bring his fleet together. And he gets notified that the French are anchored outside Trincomalee. Now, at this point, Hughes lifts anchor and tries to go to the garrison's aid, but unfortunately arrived a day too late. Suffren, by this point, had managed to take Trincomalee. He managed to hold the harbour. And if you're sort of going, well, hang on, Alex, if they're starting off holding Trincomalee, how can this not be a victory for the French? Because they've already achieved their aim. Well, the British weren't there to fight them. And there's also what happens next. So Suffren is safe in armour. He's got Trincomalee. But he has a problem. He's Suffren. He is Suffren. And he is always eager for combat. He always is, despite his second in command. And many of his officers going, why are you doing this? He's going, I have more ships! I have 14 ships in line. Edward Hughes has 12. I will win this fight. I will win this fight. So, the French exited the harbour to fight the British. He felt that the destruction of the British fleet would simplify land operations and would, for both them and their Masorian allies, he felt that that by destroying the British fleet, he would give France a great victory. He felt that by destroying the British fleet, he would secure the Indian Ocean. Instead, what you get is a stalemate, because they exited harbour. Suffren gives a signal to form battle. His subordinates don't want to do it. They don't want to go into a fight, it seems. They're also having trouble with wind, and so at best a ragged line is arranged. Suffren at this point then gives orders to hold fire until close quarters, and tries to communicate this by firing a gun from his flagship, the Heros. Because, well, they're not really doing what he's telling them to do. But the trouble is, again, every ship is its own fiefdom. And the captains misinterpret this firing as an order to open fire. So they open fire, beginning the action. Now, at this point, we have real fun. Because, well, Suffren and Hughes basically take the fight to each other. Heros, assisted by Lustre and Ajax, while Hughes, aboard HMS Superb, assisted by Burford, Sultan, Eagle, Hero, and Monarcha. Notice there might be a slight difference between the eagerness of the two sides' captains to actually get into combat going on here. Just pointing something. it's actually eventually Suffren signals for assistance, and Saint Michael and Annibal decide to stay away. Don't actually take any notice of it. You can say they're insubordinate captains. You could also say they didn't notice the command. There are lots of reasons I'm sure they had. Brilliant tried to near action and give assistance, but then Ajax is forced to withdraw with heavy damage, and Artisan comes in to replace her. An hour later, Heros's main mast was brought crashing down, and Suffren's forced to try and scramble, so the British did not think he'd struck his colours, because that would mean he'd surrendered. At this point, he'd also run out of ammunition. He'd fired 1,800 rounds at the British ships, and he was firing powder alone in an attempt to fool the enemy. I'm sure the enemy hadn't noticed that they weren't actually getting hit by balls. You were kept pounding, but they weren't getting hit by anything. Now, on the individual ends of the line, the battle does seem to have favoured the French slightly more. Isis, Worcester, Monmouth were badly damaged, and Exeter's captain was killed in action and disabled. But at 17:30 hours, after roughly 3 hours of battle, if you're being generous, the wind shifted, and the advantage was given to the French fleet by the winds. So the ships at the outer line started getting closer to the centre of the battle, which added more to the main battle. So at this point, Hero lost her main mast and mizzenmast, and Worcester lost her main topmast. But night falls, darkness ends the battle. Now, there seems to be a difference of opinion. I think Suffren probably did want to try and give chase to Hughes after the battle, but the French fleet seemed to have mostly been dripping and drabbing into Trincomalee Harbour and beginning to repair their damage, and the British fleet, well, the land commanders at Madras were so shocked by its appearance, they recalled their troops from the field in case the French attempted to attack Madras. At this point, Suffren begins what is almost his traditional post-battle practice. He'd done this at after Negapatan. Oh, good lord, I keep making that up. Please note, I will try and get that battle better, and I will do a video about that battle just when I can get it better and pronounce it better. He carried on his traditional thing of, well, arresting 3 of his captains. Sends them to Ile-de-France for punishment for their performance in the battle. At this point, there is some unusual help for him, because even the Calcutta Gazette, i.e. something which is informed by the British perspective, felt that Suffren was very poorly supported by his subordinates, and wrote that, a commentator wrote that they are unworthy to serve such a great a man. But I would be worried about that, because the British also did like the fact he kept executing his captains, because it was reducing the ability of his ships to act wonderfully. And whilst it might encourage them all to greater valour, it does also reduce the level of experience and senior officers he has available for independent commands and manoeuvrings of his fleet. Something which I'm sure did not dawn on the British at all. So I would take any letters to the editor speaking about how, terrible the performance of the French ships had been, with a large pinch of salt. And I know I get told by people, no, they didn't do this in that time. No, this is something that these people this time, they were all honourable. They only wrote to the letters to the editor when it was truthful and it was important. And I go, you are a nice soul. You are truly a kind human being. You are the kind of person who should run a country, as long as every other country is run by someone like you. At this point, though, it made even more fun because Hughes decides that, frankly, Madras is too exposed in Anchorage for the monsoon season, so he sails for Bombay. Takes his whole fleet through the early days of monsoon, and, well, some of the ships actually took 2 months to arrive in Bombay, but once they're in Bombay, there is, of course, a beautiful set of facilities there to repair them. And it's a good thing because, let's be honest, Scepter still has a task to do, including she gets involved in capturing some Dutch East Indiamen. Yes! Capture of Dutch East Indiamen. Well, that's what the painting is actually of. That is what the painting above that I used for the HMS Scepter is of. Is this a great and glorious battle against overwhelming odds? No. Is it a rich battle? Yes. Is it a battle the Dutch were probably expecting? No. You see, what happens is the Netherlands is invaded in January 1795 by the French. And, well, HMS Scepter is sent to escort British East India Company convoy around the Cape of Good Hope and to India and China. And she's also carrying mail. That's a normal thing, you have them carrying the mail. Because, again, this ship is unlikely to be stopped. There aren't many things which are likely to stop her unless she runs into a major enemy fleet. Let's be honest, your average frigate is going to go, "Oh, that's a third rate. Oh, I'm not going to ask any more questions. I'm going to get out of that thing's way." A pack of frigates, maybe? But even then, prepare to take a pounding. That's the simple answer. Prepare to take a pounding. So she arrives in St. Helena on her way. She's putting in for water. And she gives them the news of that. She also gives them the news, or rather the orders, dated the 9th of February 1795, that Royal Navy vessels and British letters of marque, aka British government-mandated pirates, they're usually called privateers. Remember that, Alex. Remember it. It's privateers. When you have a letter of marque, you are an honest gentleman doing honest work. It doesn't matter that you're basically the same as a pirate. It doesn't matter. You have a letters of marque. You are special. Okay. So, well, they were all allowed now to not only detain French vessels, but also Dutch vessels and cargoes, bringing them into British ports so they might be detained provisionally. Detained provisionally. Yeah. Well, this meant that when you have another convoy coming this way, the Dutch convoy coming away, this is going to present an opportunity. Especially when the Dutch convoy, which had been 16 East Indiamen, big merchant ships, escorted by a brig, a corvette, had all set sail, but they had broken up in May. In May, they divided because of the storm. 8 had been forced to turn back to the Cape. 8 had carried on. And those 8 which carried on and had the brig with them, had the corvette with them, actually picked up another Dutch ship, a whaler, and they all managed to make it to neutral Norway. They managed to make it to a safe space. Safe-ish space. However, that left 8. And combined with the arrival of HMS Scepter at St. Helena was the arrival of Swallow, a British East India Company packet ship, armed with probably 16 6-pounders and some swivel guns at this point, but officially she could only carry 8 guns. She would be turned into the Royal Navy, would later, when they took her over from the East India Company, would turn her into what is basically a carronade frigate. So, she's an interesting vessel. Anyway, in St. Helena, there are also a couple of other large East India Company vessels. Large ones that look a bit like 4th rates. Including the General Goddard, which is also in the painting, and, well, has some interesting experience in her service. Some very interesting experience in her service. And was actually one of those very ships possessing a letter of marque. Yes, Don't worry, the East India Company is here. They do like letters of marque because, well, that legalizes so much of what they do. It just does. As also the Man ship, which was another East India Company ship, as you know, suggested. They have various quite heavy armaments. For a merchant vessel, they really do spend a lot of their space on carrying cannon. Anyway, Captain Essington, who is the captain of HMS Scepter, managed to persuade Colonel Brooke to not only allow him to do this with the East India Company vessels, who are happy to do it, but also lend him some troops that he can put on the East India Company vessels so they have boarding marines. Can you see what's happening now? Yes. This is going to make Captain Essington very rich. Probably a few other people very rich. Now, they set out on the 3rd of June. There are 5 more East India Company ships which set out later, but it's only the Busbridge, which is another of those so interestingly well armed for a merchant vessel, East India Company vessel, that meets up with this little squadron. And, well, on the 10th of June, they capture the Huli, which was a Dust East Indian, and Swallow escorts that into St. Helena. And then Swallow returns to the squadron with more sailors. At this point, Manship and Busbridge lost contact with Essington's squadron due to bad weather. But don't worry, on the 14th of June, Essington's squadron sighted 7 sail. Ah yes, 7 sailing ships have been sighted. At 0100 hours, the very next day, 15th of June, General Goddard sailed through the Dutch fleet. They fired on her. She didn't fire back. She literally just took their measure. Later that morning, and when we say later, not a lot later, there was a little bit more of exchange of shots. Nothing much. It was desultory at best. The Dutch surrender. The Busbridge returns, and the Asia, another of those East India Company ships, arrives and helps them with boarding the Dutch vessels. There are no casualties on either side, and the British brought their prizes into St. Helena on the 17th of June. What was funny at that point was that eventually they gathered an entire convoy of 20 vessels to sail back to the UK. And they lost 3 Dutch vessels on the way. One escaped and managed to wreck itself on the Scilly Isles. But the captures were an interesting thing. They had occurred before Britain had declared war on the Latvian Republic, which took over from the Dutch after they'd been conquered by the French. However, this was still worked around for the prize rules. The vessels became droits to the crown. Now you might ask what that means, and you're not the only one. When I first heard it years and years ago, when I was first starting in naval history and first really looking into it, and it just said droits of the crown, droits of the admiralty, kept coming up, and I was going, what does this mean? Because it's being used when they can't use prizes, but they're giving these people money, so is it another form of prize? No. So, it basically, and I'm looking at the definition I have written down in front of me, it refers to customary rights or prerequisites formerly belonging to the Lord High Admiral or to the Crown. And it's things which are paid to the Exchequer. So, the droits consist of flotsam, jetsam, Or lingen, that's goods or wreckage on the seabed that is attached to a buoy so that it can be recovered. Treasure, derelict maritime within the admiral's jurisdiction. All fines, forfeitures, ransoms, reconnaissances, and pecuniary punishments. All sturgeons, whales, porpoises, dolphins, grampuses, and such large fishes. All ships and goods of the enemy coming into any creek, road, or port by durance or mistake. All ships seized at sea, salvaged with the share of prizes, such shares being afterwards called tenths, in imitation, this is of the what have been given by the French. But there's an interesting history about them. It's an imitation of the original French law, and that's where droit actually came from. Because this was the thing that really interested me when I first got it. Is I thought it might be a Latin or etc. for that, and no, it comes from French. So I presume it came over the Normans. But what does that all mean? It means that whilst these aren't technically prizes because we weren't technically at war, these are now considered flotsam and jetsam, because their country they were serving doesn't exist anymore. So don't worry, that means we can give you prize money in account to 2/3 of the value of the Dutch ships. So, £61,331, 15 shillings and 2 pennies were distributed amongst the officers, crew of Sceptre, General Goddard, Bushbridge, Asia, and Swallow. Let's put that in today's money, shall we? According to the Bank of England inflation calculation and website, which is free to go and use, the £61,331 in 1795 would today in 2024 equals 6.1 million. Nearly a little bit more than that, but 6.1 million. That was a fairly good return on investment for a few days' work, wasn't it? This adds to the point. This is the value of prizes. In this period, that's an absolute fortune. That is an absolute fortune for the senior officers and even the sailors involved. That's years' worth of wages. That's why there's a painting made of the occasion. People are rather happy about it. It's made a lot of people very, very happy. Unfortunately, Scepter's career was not always so great, and she does actually end up being wrecked. By that time, she was under the command of Captain Valentine Edwards, and she was caught at anchor in a storm in November 1799 in Table Bay. That's near the Cape of Good Hope, for those who don't know. The captain had ordered the topmast struck, had the fore and main yards lowered in order to ease the ship in the strengthening winds, and she'd even fired the traditional feu de joie on the occasion of the gunpowder plot. So the ship seems to be completely fine from all outside observers. About 12:30 hours, the main anchor cable parted. They put down a secondary one. That also broke. At approximately 1900 hours, the ship was driven ashore onto a reef at Woodstock Beach, which is the site of the present-day Royal Cape Yacht Club, and was battered to pieces there. From the ship, it's reckoned there was 1 officer, 2 midshipmen, 47 seamen, and 1 marine who were saved from the wreck, but 9 of those died on the beach. It was actually not that far from from where a similar-sized Danish vessel, the Oldenburg, had wrecked in the same hurricane. But the Oldenburg had managed to save all 446 men from it. The captain of that vessel had managed to save all of them. They did a court-martial, all were acquitted of the survivors, no blame was apportioned for the loss of the ship. And honestly, I think the problem is that the cable's parted and it's just the luck of the draw sometimes. A few hundred yards can be the difference between hitting rocks when you're coming through and having your keel wrecked, or actually keeping stability until you hit the shore. And then you can maybe get off the ship before it disintegrates completely. Your best lifeboat always, at sea or in any scenario like that, is the big ship. As long as the ship's afloat, that's your best chance of survival. Getting off that ship is when you run the risk. That's why the Mary Celeste was always considered such an odd tale, because they'd abandoned their ship. And yeah, the one thing you don't do is abandon the primary ship. Nothing else can make you survive better. Nothing else can improve your chances of living better than being on that ship. In contrast to Scepter, Dictator has quite a long life. She is, well, broken up in 1817, but again, launched in 1783, so she had served, or rather lived, 34 years. Not as long-lived as some vessels, no. Not as long-lived as some, certainly not as long-lived as the, I think it was Crown class vessel? No, it was the Black Prince class vessel, HMS Wellesley, which I mentioned earlier, which of course survived all the way until 1940 when she was sunk by the Luftwaffe. But she did well. Dictator did well. For a vessel who spends most of her career in the Mediterranean and in European waters, and finds herself in all sorts of weird little battles, she's really good. Her largest battle is the Battle of Copenhagen in 1807, the second attack on Copenhagen, when the Royal Navy made Copenhagening a verb. But prior to that, she'd arrived late for Trinidad, still taking part, but late. She'd been a troopship for the Egyptian campaign. And after it, well, she has a fairly active career. I'm just getting my notes up. Sorry, my antivirus decided it was going to be helpful and smart and got full screen to tell me of its latest scan and details, and blocked my notes. Why? Why do that to me? It's not helpful. I like my notes. It helps me, it stops me getting the dates wrong, which is the joy of my particular form of dyslexia. Getting dates confused. It can be fun. I can get the 18th and 19th century and go, hang on, I'm in the wrong century. It's always fun when you're a historian. Anyway, after Copenhagen, she got to take part in the Gunboat War, including the Battle of Lignaur. Now, the Battle of Lignaur is a cool little battle, and that's the one we're going to be covering for her history. But it's also worth noting that she took part in the Battle of Lake Bourne, which was a British victory, I would say, in part thanks to her presence. And she was part of Cochrane's fleet off New Orleans, this time in her troopship form. And again, this class shows the versatility of these ships. They were able to be converted to troopships, converted back to third rates, converted to troopships, used as hospital ships. They did all sorts of different missions, because they were a good core construction. They really were. Now, the Battle of Lignaur, how do I put this politely? It's pretty much the end of the Danish-Norwegian naval involvement in the Napoleonic Wars. Because, you see, the Royal Navy has this thing called HMS Dictator. And whilst she's backed up by three, we're going to loosely call them brigs. One had 18 guns, the Calypso. The other two had 14 guns, that's the Podagus and the Flamer. They were literally seeking out the last of the Danish-Norwegian ships. And, well, what was really, really silly was the Danish-Norwegians actually let them have the battle. The first thing you want to do when you have a frigate and a handful of supposed brigs left is avoid the battle with the ship of the line and a handful of brigs. Really sensible to do so. Really sensible to avoid that battle. Now, I have to admit, the Najdon does have an interesting history. That's the frigate she ends up fighting. She had originally been destroyed in the occupation in the Copenhagen 1807. She had been an under construction ship of the line. But the Danes had found that the timbers on the starboard side were essentially intact, so they used these starboard side timbers to build the frigate. But she's armed with 26 18-pounder guns, 6 18-pounder carronades, and 4 6-pounder guns. She could be called, I would suppose, a 36-gun frigate. But yeah, I don't think I would want to take her against something which was carrying 26 24-pounder guns on its gun deck, 26 18-pounder guns on its upper gun deck, 10 4-pounder guns, and 2 9-pounder guns. Now, yes, carronades do allow you to fire up, but as we already have talked about in the Battle of Valparaiso videos, carronades have an interesting disadvantage when it comes to range combat. And in this scenario, you're dealing with something which has a distinct advantage in range combat. Namely, it is a ship of the line. Now, Najdon was under the command of Hans Holm, and he anchored his ship near the island of Sandoya, near Trevzast. He felt secure there. He believed no British ship would risk running ashore in the waters, which were difficult to navigate, in order to attack him. And so, he accepted, not only did he anchor his ship there, he accepted an invitation to dine with the captain of another of his vessels, and then went ashore after his meal. Lovely. It was from the hills above, where he went ashore on the island he'd anchored near, that he realised that the British ships were not only more than happy to come get him, they were actually inside the archipelago and headed in his direction. He rushed back and ordered his ships along an inner route to head towards Lingnol. Paragus was in the van of the British squadron. They had a pilot aboard who's familiar with the waters. Wonder how they got one of those. And she still managed to run aground at Bushkestein. At this point, Captain Steward, this is of HMS Dictator, ordered Flamer to stay behind and assist the Paragus. After all, this proved sensible because several smaller Danish-Norwegian vessels attacked the two of them. These vessels included Lieutenant Panaman, who had an armed launch to Kierbucht, and gunboat number 3 under command of Lieutenant Ring. There were 4 additional gunboats from the Andreno division, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Didriksen, and the battery of Dingens, which was on the seaward side of Barrow Island, also fired on 2 brigs. Despite all this, Paragus and Farmer sustained some damage. They were eventually able to rejoin Dictator after the main battle was over, and were, largely speaking, unaffected. Anyone would think gunboats versus actually even a modicum of a proper warship was not necessarily the strongest idea. Even in volume, if we consider what happened to Dictator's sister. Najdon tried to push herself as far down the Lignor Sound as she could, and anchored between Holmen and Odden. She detached her supporting vessels to fight the Paragus and Flamer, and at this point, Holm assumes again that Dictator, that Captain Steward, would not follow him. Now, at this point, I'd have said that there's an old phrase in British history called in for a penny, in for a pound. It's been around for a long time. And this is where intelligence and understanding your opponents really helps. But I'd have said, even if you haven't got that, if you've already had the estimation that these waters were too tight and narrow for the British to come in after you, and they have come in after you, then you are just reaffirming again, I'm sure they won't do that. You're just asking for them to come in after you. And in the great history of the Royal Navy, guess what Captain Stewart did? He sailed into the Sound, dropped anchor behind him, ran ashore with his broadside perpendicular to the Sound, and then using his anchor for leverage, as only an absolute nutter of a captain would do, i.e. your standard Royal Navy captain at this period, positioned Dictator so his broadside was against Nagihan at a range of roughly 35 to 40 metres. Nagihan, unable to turn because of the tight spaces in, has his broadside pointing away from the Dictator and is dead in the water. At this point, the thing going through your head should probably be, I'm facing a nutter, I surrender! He's done the equivalent of a handbrake turn in a ship of the line. Okay? Not even really the turn part. He's just pumped on the handbrake, pulled it up and gone, hello, you're blocked in your garage, and I'm firing straight into you, man. Good luck. So at 21:30 hours, Dictator decided to just unleash, because he didn't surrender, a 15-minute barrage against Nagihan. And at this point, you're probably going, Alex, where are you getting all this information from? Well, there are several sources, there are some good books, and I have to admit, actually, if you want a quick look, I would say the Battle of Ignore Wikipedia page, where I nicked some of these pictures from. Scanning through was very, very good. Had one fact in there that was reckoning it was 4 tons of ordnance expelled. Didn't have a citation for it, and I haven't found where they've got it from. But I did my own maths, and I wouldn't be surprised if roughly in the time 4 tons of ordnance does bear out. But they don't have a source for it there. But what they do have a source of is the very same source I was using to get for this information, which is the Battle of Ignore on the London Gazette. Now, this is me having taken all 4 pages and stitched them together. They don't come like that. They come as individual pages, which you can download as individual PDFs. So I do apologise, but, you know, this was the best way I could have of showing this off, of showing you this account, of showing you this absolute, honestly, Chad of a man doesn't seem to be an accurate description. It's a phrase which I was told by my little cousin recently. I do not and cannot overemphasize that this man, this captain and his crew are right up there for me with the swordfish observers who flew into Taranto waist deep in aviation fuel. I mean, there are people who do scary stuff for fun, and there is this group. And I mean, there is this group. What they were doing was obscene on several levels. I'm going to read it to you now. And I hope you can read along with me. I know it's going to be very small text putting it all up there, but I did want to put it up there, and the link is also down in the description down below. I have the honour to inform you that yesterday evening, being off Mado with the brigs named in the margin, the mastheads of the enemy squadron was seen over the rocks, and Captain Robiliard of the Podagus, in the most handsome manner, volunteered to lead the squadron in to attack them, he having a man on board acquainted with the place, and as neither the masters or the pilots of either of the ships conceived themselves equal to the charge, I did not hesitate to accept his kind offer, well knowing that the British flag would meet with nothing but honour in such hands. In the entrance of the passage, the Padagus unfortunately took the ground, by which circumstance I was deprived of the valuable and gallant services of the commander during the remainder of the day, and was in consequence obliged to leave the Flamer to her assistance. But in Captain Weir of the Calypso I found everything that could be wished for, which in great measure made up for the loss which I had sustained in Padagus and Flamer. But by this time, 7:30 p.m., we had arrived within 1 mile of the enemy, who were running inside the rocks under a press of sail. The Calypso, which had also grounded for a short time, was now leading us through the passage, and both she and ourselves engaged with the squadron and numerous gunboats. However, at 9:30, I had the satisfaction, after sailing 12 miles through a passage, in some places scarcely wide enough to admit our studding sail booms being out, of running the Dictator's bow upon the land with her broadside towards the enemy, within hail as per margin, who were anchored with springs on their cables close together, and supported by gunboats in the small creek of Linogne. The Calypso most nobly followed up as well. In half an hour the frigate was literally battered to atoms, and the flames bursting forth from her hatchways, the brigs had also struck, and most of the gunboats were completely beaten, and some sunk. The action had scarcely ceased and the ship afloat than we found ourselves again attacked by gunboats, which had retreated on seeing the fate of their squadron, and were again collecting from all quarters. But Captain Weir of the Calypso, having taken a most advantageous position, engaged them with the greatest gallantry and effort. Indeed, I am at a loss how to express my approbation of the prompt exertion of this gallant and meritorious officer. The Padagus and the Flamer, in meantime, were warmly engaged with numerous batteries and gunboats, both brigs being aground, but by the uncommon exertion and extreme gallantry of Captain Robiliard and the officers and crews of the brigs, they at least got afloat, very much cut up. On this occasion, Lieutenant England particularly distinguished himself. At 3 a.m., having got the Dictator, Calypso, and the prize brigs in the fair way, we attempted to get out through the passages, when we were assailed by a division of gunboats from behind the rocks, so situated that not a gun could be brought to bear on them from either vessel. In this situation both prize brigs grounded, and notwithstanding every exertion on the part of Lieutenant James Wilkie on his ships and the Leonard, who had extinguished fire on board, which was burning with great fury, and Lieutenant Hooper of the Calypso in the keel, we had to abandon them to complete wrecks, humanity forbidding setting them on fire, owing to the number of wounded men they had on board. I cannot conclude this letter without mentioning in terms of praise Mr. William Buchanan, the first lieutenant of this ship, a most gallant and excellent officer. From the nature of the attack I have been obliged to lengthen my report, probably more than the service performed justifies, but in that case I trust you will only attribute it to my anxiety to endeavour to do justice to a set of officers and men who I am sure have done their duty to admiration. The conduct of every individual on board His Majesty's ship I have had the honour to command has been highly meritorious, and I cannot omit to add the names of Lieutenant Duell, Dutton, and Edwards, Captain Tristot, Lieutenant James Baker, Lieutenant F.M. Namara of the Royal Marines, Mr. R. West, the Master, and Mr. John Luckley, the Purser. The skilful attention of Mr. Hay, the Surgeon, to our own men as well as our enemies, has been beyond all praise, and he speaks in the highest terms of Mr. Sanderson, his assistant. Captains Robiliard and Weir mentioned the conduct of all their officers and men to have been such as characterise Britons on such occasions, and I am sure I can with great justice add my tribute of applause. Enclosed I have the honour to transmit a list of the killed, and although I cannot help deploring the loss of so many brave men, it is much less than could be reasonably expected. The Danes acknowledge to have lost about 300 killed and wounded. I rather suspect 5. Our ships have suffered extremely in their hulls, masts and rigging. I have the honour to be J.P. Stewart, Captain. And he then goes on to list even more and add even more details, because that's the kind of captain he is. And that's the kind of report writer he is. And as such, historians love him. We really do. I mean, we really, really love him. You have a captain like that, that's giving you all the information you need. And then you go and look up other accounts and you find out this battle was a lot. It's a lot, but it's done because Dictator can do it. And he can do it in Dictator. In a 74, he couldn't have got into those narrows. He could in a 64. And he pulls off that. By the way, if you ever want some fun reading, go and read some of the editions of the London Gazette. I mean, seriously, some of the captains do these these almost short blimp reports. We had an action, the enemy lost, da-da-da-da-da. And some are like Captain James Stewart here. They give you their full account, and even then, when you go and read others' accounts, you go, oh, frigate, you actually, even with all that floridness, all that expression, you've barely covered the surface of what you did. So, summary about these ships. I do remember when key ships were supposed to be 25 minutes long. This is going to be an hour and 20, isn't it? If not half an hour. Hour and a half. I'm going to start off with a question and then I'm going to get into the summary. The question today is going to be this. So 64s are some of those cute Age of Sail ships which someday I would love to write a book about because I don't think they get enough attention. I think everything goes to 74s and the 64s get pretty much ignored, and yet they do some of the most random, some of the most intriguing bits of naval history, and you look through their captains through history and they've had some of the best the Royal Navy could get. I'm often asked where the spirit of things like the Trafalgar class destroyers, etc. comes from, and I go, you can find it in every era. You can. I'd say to an extent the 64s have it in this era. I would certainly say there are a fair number of 64 captains who have that kind of, we might not be a first rate, we might not even be the biggest third rate, but you're gonna notice us, and you're gonna listen to what we have to shoot at you. And that's really today's question. I'd like you to think about each era. I talk about the Trafalgar class destroyers on this channel a lot. The fact the Royal Navy picked them for their officers for a combination of their aggression, but also their ability, their knowledge, their understanding, their capabilities as officers. And asked them to perform the feats which were beyond what could or should be expected of a ship. And they did it. So I'd love your opinions on what ships those are in each era. And you can look at the other navies if you want. There are several navies who have this character of there is always an era, there are certain ships which are expected to rise above and beyond. That every time they have a really thorny problem they have to work out how to deal with. That's going to require as much brain power as it is going to require brute strength. They reach for. I would argue for the US Navy it was the heavy frigates that really started that. I would argue those heavy frigates, Ironsides and her sisters, the true heavy frigates, they're the first generation of theirs. The vessels which really demonstrated it, that, when we have a problem, a really thorny problem, those ships and their crew will reach for it. I would argue that such a spirit is encapsulated when we talk about stories of things like from Star Trek, USS Enterprise. I would say quite a lot of the single ship scenarios we see presented in fiction and science fiction are based on these sort of traits, these ships, because those are the interesting vessels. The difference is that often in science fiction, those are the big vessels, Enterprise is the big Galaxy class starship in for Next Generation, and pretty much every generation she's usually one of the bigger ships. Whereas we're talking more often about a middle of the road vessel. Star Trek would be more likely to have to be a Miranda class vessel, which the story would have to be about, and the Enterprise would be off being the glorious flagship, whilst the Captain, we've got a problem. Oh, another one. Or, Captain, we think we have a challenge right up your alley. Oh, great. That's the scenario. So I'd love to hear your opinions on that. As for this class, they're not the last class of 64s. Are they the best class of 64s ever built? I would say not necessarily for sailing characteristics. Not necessarily for sailing characteristics. But I would argue it's hard to find a class which in their period doesn't get less involved. I mean, between the four of them, they are everywhere, and they're doing all sorts of things. You've got Africa doing Trafalgar. And then you've got Dictator doing a handbrake stop and destruction in 1812 in the Gunboat War. And you also had Africa off trying to chase the USS Constitution. I think that would have been an interesting fight. I know people always try and do a history of going Constitution versus HMS Victory, who would win? That's not really a chance for the Constitution. But against Africa, she still doesn't have a chance. But it'll be an interesting fight. It'll be a far more interesting fight than against the first rate. Against the first rate, if you're a frigate locked in a fight with a first rate and it's one-on-one, good luck. I hope your last will and testament is fully organised. But against a 64, what can I say? She takes what is the Danish-Norwegian equivalent of a heavy frigate and takes it apart in case of Dictator. So, yeah, but she does manage to trap her in. Ooh. See, that's a far more interesting fight to me. That's a far more interesting question and thing to think about. I like this class, and I liked doing this for key ships. Again, I'm not sure if you all like this idea for key ships to occasionally do Age of Sail classes. The trouble is with doing key ships about a single Age of Sail ship is unless it's something like HMS Victory or the Constitution, there often isn't enough to give a complete overview of a vessel's life in terms of its creation, the reasons behind its creation, all these things. Whereas when you pick a class like this, or this 64s, where there are 4 ships, you have enough written about their concept and you can take people through their history to fill out what might have started life as a 25-minute series and is turned into an hour and a half series. Let's be honest, I suck at making 25-minute videos. I do realize this. I give up. I can make a 60-second short, just about, with enough practice and enough edits. And I can make 60-second shorts by cutting videos down to a 60-second short for a small bit of it. But, yeah, my average video length is 90 minutes. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to this little class, and yeah, I have a plan on what Age of Sail classes will come next at some point in this year. There's going to be a couple of them, because there are some really cool classes, and it's often forgotten they're built-in classes. The interesting conversation I had with someone was when I was talking about the glorious Heritage class from the Andromeda series. And they were going, yeah, well, I can't think of anything which this is modelled on, because, it's a class, but each one's almost a unique build in its finishing. And I went, that's the Age of Sail shipbuilding model. No, they're all the unique ships. No. Quite a lot of them, vast majority of them are built as part of classes. They're built to a standardised design. But because each yard takes such pride in finishing them, they're each finished in almost a unique fashion in terms of their stylings and some of their internal fixtures and fittings and their furniture. And it's the Age of Sail model. One of the things I like about that series, because Gene Roddenberry really goes into his love of Age of Sail. So what do you have coming? That's gone. Okay. So what do we have coming next week? Next week, I'm fairly sure, from memory, it's Hermes, Hosho, and Langley. The conception, creation, construction, and careers. It should be fun, and I hope it will be useful and interesting. That'll be the Tuesday video. The Saturday video to come out tomorrow is the long patrol for last Thursday's live, which of course was a full-length discussion on Admiral Battenberg and how it would have been if he'd remained as First Sea Lord. I hope you'll enjoy it all. And I'm sorry that the usual slide I end these videos with is missing, but yeah, I hope you look out for next Tuesday's video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for supporting the channel by watching. If you like the video, please do like. Maybe consider sharing it on social media and subscribing to the channel. Both of those last things really do help with circulation, really do help a channel grow. And if you want to support the books and the other work which goes into acquiring and turning these videos into reality, well, there's membership of the channel, there's Patreon, there's Ko-fi. Ko-fi primarily goes to Iron Brew, I have to admit, but we all need our caffeine to keep us going, and mine comes in liquid orange fizzy form. Thank you very much, take care, and hope you have a lovely evening.